SCP-682 found itself hurtling through an unstable dimensional rift and into some fresh new hell. 682 rose from the dirt and mulch beneath its body and found itself on level 23 of the backrooms, which had the distinguishing characteristics of being a spherical planetoid formed from the interlocking of countless towering trees. It was commonly known as the Petrified Garden, and it was the first of many backrooms levels that took the form of a globe rather than an infinite maze. I know that it is hard to imagine a spherical world, because in our native reality the planet Earth is a flat plane with ice walls on the side. Just kidding. The flat Earth model is an inaccurate and roundly discredited conception of cosmography without any empirical evidence to support it. Could you imagine if we were peddling this kind of conspiratorial fiction here in a YouTube video? Anyway, back to our regularly scheduled program about an indestructible lizard traveling through another dimension. That's real. Nearly all of the tree specimens present on level 23 had equivalent species that were native to the front rooms, aka our reality. There were birch trees, cedars, redwoods, white oaks, and many more common types intertwined with trees that were either long extinct or never before seen on Earth. To 682, a tree was a tree. But then again, the Keter-class SCP wasn't known for having a deep and abiding respect for nature. Right now, what was flashing through its reptilian head was a need to inflict violence, preferably on the Old Wanderer that warped SCP-682 to level 23, but really any entity that crossed its path was liable to get a taste of the old maw and claw. Thankfully, the backrooms had a habit of deploying wave after wave of bizarre creatures from who knows where. Not more than a couple of levels ago, 682 had been faced with a veritable army of these backrooms entities and came out of the fight victorious. By this point, the hard-to-destroy reptile was well acquainted with death rats, death moths, clumps, smilers, and hounds, all of which were no doubt lurking somewhere in the woodwork of level 23.
You can't run. You can hide, but I will find you and destroy you.
682 was on the hunt once again, walking through the entangled mess of trees like an unstoppable engine of rage. It had certainly been some time since 682 had encountered an entirely new entity, though it wasn't exactly clamoring for a new lore expansion. Since 682 was a being that despised all forms of life and wanted to destroy it, the reptile had the outlook of, the less entities that were present throughout the backrooms, the better. So when the Volpe appeared before 682, the anomalous monster was less than thrilled. But I'll bet that you viewers at home are excited to get to know a brand new backrooms entity after such a long wait. So why don't we give you the Carfax? Fox facts? We're going to tell you about the Volpe now, which no matter how it appears to the untrained eye is not, in fact, a fox. The Volpe's entity number is 119, and its name comes from the Corsican word for fox. But I must once again clarify, this entity is not actually a fox. The easiest ways to distinguish a Volpe from its more well-known counterpart in the front rooms are the abnormally elongated snout and the secondary tail. Volpes have been known to dwell almost exclusively in levels of the backrooms that display forest-like characteristics, which one could imagine would be very few of them, but genuinely, who knows at this point? There could be an infinite number of infinite forests infinitely scattered across infinite layers of the backrooms, and if that were to be the case, there would be an infinite number of Volpes in all of them. An Entity 119 in its natural habitat will dwell within a subterranean den, where the Volpe digs itself in order to provide shelter and protect itself from low temperatures. These dens can be unusually elaborate and may comprise multiple branching tunnels and security measures, such as a collection of twigs that can alert the Volpe to intruders when they are disturbed. This complexity is somewhat warranted, because the Volpe stores a plentiful stash of food deep within the den, making it very unlikely for them to go hungry. These Volpes are rather clever, aren't they? Perhaps they are, but not quite clever enough to avoid being effortlessly crushed by SCP-682, as it brought its two front claws down on top of the entity. Better luck next time, Entity 119. Not that there will be a next time. SCP-682 continued to move along the surface of the planetoid, and eventually entered into a cavern created by the intertwining roots. Delving beneath level 23's forested crust, the reptile found itself inside of a glow room. an underground chamber lit by the bioluminescence of glowworm-like entities, which had been given the name Gardener's Sauries. As their name would imply, these creatures constantly made noises that sounded vaguely like the word sorry. These pitiful worms crawled around the glowing fungi and smaller flora, making their signature noises, and SCP-682 was absolutely not sorry to mercilessly devour every one of the Gardener's Sauries. The room was much darker with the absence of the Gardener's Sauries, but only temporarily so, as SCP-682 was able to take on the bioluminescent glow of its own and light its way deeper beneath the surface of Level 23. It soon entered an area of ancient ruins that seemed man-made, yet overgrown with moss and long abandoned. SCP-682 had seen sparing evidence throughout the backrooms of abandoned human civilizations, but the ruins of Level 23 were closer in appearance to the structures built by the people of 682's native reality. They were similar to some of the great wonders of the world, but with fundamental differences. For example, a number of near replicas of the pyramids of Giza deviated in shape enough from the originals to be arranged in a spherical formation. The other buildings found within this area of Level 23 had obvious counterparts, but none of the architecture represented modern design trends. The most advanced buildings were equivalent to buildings in the front rooms constructed in and before 1000 AD. In and among the ancient ruins could be found a large variety of artifacts, all of which seemed equally to be shoddy knockoffs of relics from the front rooms. SCP-682 stepped across the fragile pottery and clay idols, quietly satisfied at the sight of many telltale signs of civilizational collapse and the utter lack of living humans. There were a few clumps fiddling around in the rubble, but 682 didn't let them get away with existing in its presence.
You dreadful rejects can return, but not Jerry. How disgusting. I miss Jerry.
SCP-682's thoughts turned to its lost companion, Entity 7. The blue hyacinth macaw had been the only tolerable presence that 682 had known within the backrooms, and sadly in the hard-to-destroy reptile's entire existence. This hateful and terrific being had never understood the meaning of love and compassion until Jerry had appeared to it. It was possible that they would never meet again, and this somber realization weighed heavily on 682's mind. The big lizard continued through the glow room and noticed an unusual plaque scrawled in rough Latin. While 682 was not an avid reader, its adaptive capabilities allowed it to translate the message that was left behind by whatever beings previously inhabited Level 23. It read, "We dedicate this great sphere of Giza to the Great Gardener, in hopes of forgiveness for the great wrong we have committed. Already our purple eyes have turned green. We have started to return to the earth, forgotten and overgrown. Our only hope is that alone and petrified we will not disappear as architects of a failed project." The first sentence was apparently a clear reference to the spherical Great Pyramid that 682 had come across earlier, but the significance of the rest remained a mystery. Whoever these failed architects were, there was no trace of them left on this planetoid. 682 didn't mourn them, of course, and it felt almost content to know that whatever grand project they had in store had crumbled, leaving their ruins occupied by the likes of clumps. It served them right for existing, for attempting to create something. Their sadness was proof enough that they'd learned their lesson and had long since faded into the ether. Maybe that's all the Backrooms was in the end. A series of failed attempts at building worlds that would ultimately be forgotten when time and people moved on to bigger and better projects. SCP-682 mused on these thoughts as it proceeded down into the very core of Level 23. To its surprise, a sight of remarkable beauty awaited the reptile within. There, countless roots found and embraced each other, surrounding the gravity-locked orb of luminescent water, an apparent source of light, nutrients, and ultimately life for the greenery of Level 23. This was the heart of the level, and it was fittingly known as the Heart of Water. 682 stared for a long time at the Heart of Water, and it wasn't really sure why. Naturally occurring wonders like this held little appeal to the reptile, but somehow this one was different. Perhaps it was because at this moment, SCP-682 truly realized how far it had come from its containment cell at Site-19. It had endured every hardship the Backrooms had thrown its way, and now it was looking upon the Heart of Water, an object that it could never have fathomed existing, and could never have reached until it truly became free and uninhibited, no longer subject to the whims of the Foundation. Then, the most unusual thing happened to SCP-682, a function of its physiology that was so rarely seen or utilized. SCP-682 shed a single tear. It flowed down the reptilian creature's snout, and then, arrested by the gravitational pull of the Heart of Water, floated away and vanished into the liquid mass. This was a private moment for 682 that not even Jerry was here to see, and yet the fall of this tear may have solidified a change in 682. It was a mixed feeling of independence and detachment. For most of its journey through the backrooms, SCP-682 had felt an urge to completely clear the abyss and show no mercy to every entity that existed within it. Whether it manifested as determination or spite, that urge had been the overriding feeling that had driven SCP-682 to progress through every level of the backrooms in sequential order. But these new feelings made it realize that even that would be playing into the hands of the backrooms. SCP-682 once thought that the backrooms were a cold and indifferent place, like an endless universe that arbitrarily created and destroyed all the beings that existed in it without purpose or reason. But that was not the case, and in fact it seemed more likely that the complete opposite was true. The Backrooms was imbued by its creators with so much obvious intention that it was practically a sentient being. The Backrooms was heavily invested in taking itself seriously, in revering every detail that made each level distinctive, and giving every entity and hazards a specific method of ruining the experience of all wanderers that passed through. SCP-682 could now see the Backrooms for what it actually was. A desperate, pathetic thing clawing for attention, but forever doomed to be obscure and unloved. It was even sadder than an indifferent universe, because it was a constructed universe that had no greater meaning than to be acknowledged for simply being something where nothing once was. It could even be said that the words on the plaque of the glow room in level 23 were the ultimate admission of hopelessness, and that there was nothing waiting for SCP-682 or any other wanderer but the similar statements of failed architects all the way down. And that was to say nothing of all the once ambitious works within the Backrooms that had been erased by happenstance. Who could even say that the numbers that correspond to Backrooms levels that SCP-682 had already traversed were even the correct ones? There could potentially be one or more entirely different numerical sequences to the levels that were equally as true to the ones who labeled them as such. If the Backrooms didn't want to be known, to be documented, to be expanded upon, I doubt that such rigid assignments of numbers would have been acceptable by its creators. It was in realizing all of this that 682 remembered the elderly explorer that had flung him into level 23. While it was true that things hadn't gone the reptile's way in that encounter, it was questionable who the real winner was when it was clear that the man had dedicated the best years of his life to researching and wandering the Backrooms. Sure, he had mastered some neat parlor tricks with the magical items native to this reality, but to be a master of the Backrooms was no better than 682 declaring itself master of the acid tank in its prior containment cell. That elderly man with the trinkets could keep his hollow victory, because 682 would still be alive and kicking when that human's bones were nothing more than set dressing left behind in some heretofore untouched level of the Backrooms. His fate would be the same as the rest of the Backrooms eventually, a joke with no real setup and punchline forgotten. To attempt to complete or destroy or uncover the mysteries behind the Backrooms was exactly what the loathsome cluster of disjointed concepts wanted, and 682 was done with giving this liminal nightmare the satisfaction. Sometimes the only way to win a game is not to play the game at all. And that was precisely how SCP-682 would approach the Backrooms from here on out. Maybe it would be trapped forever, or maybe it would be sent home at any moment, but caring about the outcome either way was a waste of precious brain power. There was only one way to deal with the desperate neediness of the Backrooms, and that was embracing and becoming internally the cold, indifferent universe that it could never be. And that was now what SCP-682 would be. Enlightened, and fully detached from this reality. It strode out of the heart of water and into another glow room, only to find an outpost of Major Explorers Group waiting for it.
Let's try something new.
SCP-682 easily broke down the door and found itself surrounded by panicked humans. Many of them were wielding pump-action squirt guns and had begun spraying 682 with what seemed to be almond-flavored water. 682 didn't react to these attacks at all, and slowly wandered towards the humans with no particular urgency.
Pardon my intrusion,
682 said, grinning with as much politeness as it could muster.
Do any of you fine people know the way back to level 9?
The humans shuddered, unsure how to answer. They stood in their silence until one brave soul came forth and spoke to SCP-682. There's a gateway inside of this outpost that can take you to the next level, said the explorer. But it appears to be one way since whatever was on the other side appears to no longer exist.
What do you mean it no longer exists?
682 asked, trying against its better judgment to make sense of the circumstances. The explorer nodded and went on, seemingly motivated by fear. We mean it's no longer part of any current archive of Backrooms-related phenomenon, and its name will likely be erased soon. Not that having the name would provide any consolation. After all, there's still no telling what is on the other side, and if it was ever what the explorers who reported on it claimed it was. Now this was an unsettling development. 682 had only just started to come to terms with the instability of reality in the Backrooms, and the notion that a level could be totally wiped from existence and leave behind a gateway to absolutely nowhere was chilling even to the immortal lizard. What would happen to 682 if the reptile stepped through the gateway? Would it find itself in the place that the gateway was once and still is connected to? Or would it simply disappear into the void as if it were never there at all? Because this was the Backrooms, there was always a third option too, as well as countless others that defied all logic. So now the question facing SCP-682 was to step into the unknown or to remain here in level 23 with the Major Explorers Group. It was a difficult decision, to say the least. The humans looked on as SCP-682 carefully weighed its options. Eventually, the reptile opened its mouth to speak on the matter.
I'll give it some thought,
682 said.
You have been very helpful for a disgusting human. So for the time being, I will permit you to continue your meaningless existence. And I guess that includes the rest of your outpost.
That's, well, thank you. Thank you, the human stammered. 682 turned and began to walk towards the heart of water. It intended to take its time with its choice, since progress through the levels of the Backrooms was no longer something that the reptile would be pursuing with reckless abandon. It heavily considered going back on its words and slaughtering all the members of the Major Explorers Group in this outpost, as it had done in all the other outposts. But it was plain to see that a human trapped in the Backrooms barely qualified as living, because nothing could be worse than being permanently stuck in the torturous abyss. 682 had no idea whether pure spite towards them was what made sparing their lives so compelling, or something else had motivated that decision. But regardless, the hard-to-destroy reptile did not destroy the humans of level 23. As it exited the base, the brave human that had spoken to it called out, "Wait, Lizard, I have to know, what are you?" 682 stopped and stared at the human. It's just we need to catalog you. I've never seen anything else in the Backrooms like you." 682 breathed out. It sounded almost like a surrender.
I am Entity 682.
After those words left its jaws, 682 wandered away from the human until it was once again sitting by the heart of water. It didn't think about the choice or the gateway immediately. For now, Entity 682 was peacefully reminiscing back to the quality time it had spent with Entity 7, Jerry, in this pointless and nonsensical place known as the Backrooms. They would meet again. That was the one thing 682 could be sure of. Somehow, some way, they would meet again. An indeterminate amount of time later, over 24 levels away from the reptile in the front rooms, the reality which it had no-clipped out of so many days and weeks ago, the researchers of the SCP Foundation had gathered together and were celebrating an unforeseen event. Almost all of them had long since given up hope that it could ever happen, and yet here they were, standing before the O5 Council and all the illustrious scientists and soldiers that had worked to make this day a reality. Everyone watched in total amazement as the heads of the Foundation declared the Keter-class SCP-682 hard-to-destroy reptile permanently neutralized. Want an anomaly of your own? Check out scpswag.com for high-quality SCP merch. Now go check out Could SCP-682 Be Contained in the Backrooms? And SCP-682 Slaughters Through the Backrooms for more of 682's journey through the Backrooms.